I will try to make this as entertaining as I can in order to make it a little bit less painful to be doing this on your weekend. So this talk is about retrospectives. Retrospectives for people, which we all are, for better or for worse. The subtitle of this talk could also be Words Mean Things. I don't think this talk needs any content warnings. We do talk about an engineering disaster, but no one is injured. Should you find that you disagree with that assessment, please find me later so that I can change things in the future. Let's talk about disasters. Who doesn't love a good disaster in which no one was injured or died? Seattle has the 2 longest floating bridges in the world. Well, if you're here, you may have been to Seattle. It's pretty close. You may have seen them. They cross Lake Washington. In 1990, one of them sank over the Thanksgiving Day weekend in a storm while it was being repurposed. And for anyone who might not be aware, Thanksgiving weekend is the biggest holiday weekend in the United States. It's 4 days off for a lot of people. There was no one working on the bridge at the time, as far as I understand, and so it was completely unattended. So when you're working on something and then you leave it for a little while and then you come back and it's broken, this is not a big surprise to a lot of people in this room, I suspect. So the public reporting on this accident was extremely simplistic, and it still is. But the official investigation found that there were 5 factors involved, and all of them were required for the bridge to fail. The situation at the time that the bridge sank, which this lovely picture is of the bridge sinking, was that they were repurposing the span that existed and building a second span nearby. The original span was built for 2-way traffic, so they were scraping the paving off with water. It's called hydrodemolition, and going to repave and repaint it, and then the other span would take traffic in the other direction. They were initially letting the water run off into the lake with like bits of paving in it and stuff, which is no good, and the Environmental Protection Agency was like, hey, cut it out, you can't do that. You can't just let that run off into the lake, that's really bad. So they had to store the water and truck it away to be treated before they could get rid of it. Since you can't store water in piles, they had to find a container to put it in. Now, floating bridges are hollow. They are made of concrete. They're a little bit like a tanker, right? They don't float because they're light, they float because they're hollow, because there's a lot of air in them. It's a density thing, right? So they looked at the bridge, they examined it really carefully, and actually the first part of doing all of this work was a really careful survey of this bridge, about 50 years old at that point, and they looked for signs of aging and wear and all of that, and they found the bridge had been significantly over-engineered. It was floating higher than it was intended to float, and the concrete was in great shape. They did a survey of all kinds of like cracks and chips and whatever, and they found that it had taken a lot less wear than they would have expected for a bridge of its age. So between the condition that it was in and how over-engineered it was, they found that they had some extra flotation that they could use, and they decided to store some of the water inside the pontoons. I can see some face palming happening already. So over the weekend, there was a storm. It was a 100-year storm, and which means that this is the worst storm that happens or has happened in 100 years, or like we expect one of these to happen about every 100 years. And one of the pontoons began taking on water and sank, dragging 7 pontoons down after it. This is a nested cascading failure. Things are more likely to break when you're messing with them. Okay, so here I have some of the coverage. We are going to watch this.
In 1940 in Seattle, the Lacey V. Murrow Bridge was named after the director of Washington State's Department of Transportation. The bridge stood for 50 years, but in November of 1990, a rehabilitation and maintenance operation on the bridge led to disaster. Spanning a short but deep section of Seattle's Lake Washington, the Murrow Bridge floated on a row of 25 hollow concrete pontoons, each 350 feet long. The pontoons were bolted together for stability and anchored to the bottom of the lake.
The conditions are just right for use of such a structure because The water conditions under which they're installed are perfect. That is, very seldom is there any ice, very seldom is there a heavy current, and the water is very deep, 200 or more feet.
In the fall of 1990, the Murrow Bridge was undergoing a facelift by means of hydrodemolition, a process in which highly pressurized water is used to break up the roadway. Since environmental regulations prohibited dumping the contaminated water into the lake, it was temporarily stored in the empty pontoons via access holes which were cut into the tops and sides of some sections. The water level inside the pontoons was carefully monitored so the structure would not be compromised. But on Thanksgiving weekend, with bridge crews short-handed, a heavy storm hit the Seattle area. Rainwater drained into the open pontoons. Winds from the storm whipped up the surface of the lake, propelling splash water into the pontoons as well. On the morning of November 25th, 8 waterlogged pontoons sunk into the lake, taking those sections of the bridge down with them and severing 12 anchoring cables of a bridge that was being constructed nearby. While luckily no one was injured, the cost of damage was estimated at $69 million. An investigation of the accident came to a sobering, if unsurprising, conclusion.
After very extensive study and very sophisticated computer modeling methods, the conclusion was that concrete pontoons simply don't float when they're full of water. A very unsophisticated mode of failure.
The Lacey V. Murrow Bridge was rebuilt 2 years later. Though it looks the same from the outside, the pontoons that support the bridge have been divided into smaller sections to minimize damage from leaks, a precaution that underscores the structural similarities between floating bridges and floating ships.
The pontoons were designed with multiple cells, not unlike the multiple cell super tankers, so that failure in one place would not bring down the entire pontoon.
What has happened here, they simply had a
It does seem pretty obvious, doesn't it? This was a giant disaster. It required a giant investigation. They sent divers down to look at the fallen pontoons and examine them and measure things and look at the cracks in them, the whole 9 yards. They checked a lot of stuff. You don't have to read that. It's super long. But I'm going to read this. This is the shortest amount of text that you can use to describe what actually happened, which is more complicated than what Mr. Professor just told us. The loads that created significant leakage were the combined effects of all accumulations of water, including rain after the windstorm, longitudinal flow, that's like water washing back and forth on the surface of the bridge, and pumping through November 24th, 1990. These loads caused static moments, that's to say pressures, that exceeded the threshold for leakage. Existing cracks were opened sufficiently to allow water to leak into the pontoon. Progressive and accelerated sinking began at this time. So what they found was that the motion of the waves and the winds were sort of twisting the bridge. They also found that water in the pontoons had not been distributed evenly and that crews had not been able to follow the schedule for pumping water out of the pontoons into the trucks. So this led to high and low water spots in the bridge where there was more tension on the joins between the pontoons because some of them were floating higher and some of them were floating lower. And the pontoon that initially failed flexed enough that existing cracks that did not leak, that were actually part of this bridge being in very good shape, opened and took on water from the lake from the bottom. So that pontoon sank and dragged 7 more down after it. I got this all from the paper, which is listed at the bottom there. Also, all of my slides will be online later, and I've given this talk before, and you can find the paper if you want it. If you've got any kind of institutional affiliation, you should be able to get it for free. No one does things that they think will blow up the world, right? No one, almost no one. We can leave aside bad actors for now because we can treat those situations as almost the same as this. People do not do things generally that they think are going to make everything bad. right? It's tempting to say that same things that those experts did in that video, that if you fill a bridge full of water, it sinks, and that the idea was bad in the first place. You should never have done that. Why did you think that was a good idea? But people, like the engineers who set this schedule up, thought about it very carefully, and they thought about their margins for error. And they had a plan, and that plan would have worked, except for, we don't know. Something that wasn't documented happened. The crews were having trouble keeping up with the plan set by the engineers. Many reasons that could have happened. They could have not had enough trucks. They could have not had enough drivers. They could have had a union strike. I don't know, anything. But that wasn't documented. So we couldn't, the whole system could not follow the plan, and then we had this failure. And because that was documented, that was not documented, we can't find out what happened. We can't go back and ask now. It's been too long. Who was there? Who even knows, right? How would we even find those people? But if we could, we'd want to ask about what a person knew at that time and what the conditions were from their perspective, because that is what will give us good insight for effective change. So let's do better. If we're thoughtful and deliberate in how we talk to each other, we can get better results. The rest of this is going to be a crash course in talking to other humans during a retrospective, or really any other time you feel like talking to another human, which is not all the time. Definitely not for me. Other ways to think of what I'm going to be talking about today: servant leadership, psychological safety. As a facilitator, your main jobs are to keep the conversation blame-free, not make bad jokes, and run a decent meeting. So let's talk first about how to talk. I always start with Miller's Law. It's foundational. In order to understand what another person is saying, you must assume that it is true and try to imagine what it could be true of. This was coined by George Armitage Miller, who's also the guy who did the research that found that your working memory can usually contain 7 items, plus or minus 2. And he does a lot of interesting, like, linguistic brain stuff. I learned about this from Suzette Hayden-Elgin in The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense, also a useful book to read if you're involved in this kind of work. So we've talked about how to understand what other people are saying. You have to assume it's true. Go from there. Next, let's talk about blame. English is a pretty blamey language. You knocked over that vase. Why did you knock over that vase, right? You could hear that there's a bad relationship happening in those sentences. I'm going to go into more of that. Yeah, you. I'm talking to you. Don't just walk away. That feels awful, doesn't it? Starting a sentence with you draws a line between yourself and the person you're addressing. So does using it too often. It creates an oppositional conversation. There's the person saying you and the person who is being you'd at. Why did you do that? Why'd you do it like that? That also feels terrible, doesn't it? Asking a question that starts with why is a request for a justification. It immediately puts the person you're addressing on the defensive. Why questions get you answers in what's called agentive language, because I knocked over the vase, which has blame in the very grammar. It's because a person did a thing. Also, agentive language is very strongly remembered by English speakers. So then you've ensured that the blame that you created sticks in everyone's mind as very important. Other things not to say: always, never, every time, should, just, why don't you just, only. There's more, but these are the least wanted in a retrospective. If you have a sibling, anything that your sibling shouted at you when they were mad that made you see red goes on this list. Or if you have a child who's reached that age, right, where they shout things at you and you're just like, I can't even with you, child, goes on that list. It might be different if you're talking about an API or an RFC when using these words, but remember that when you do, you are describing the decisions that people made. You are describing the behavior of a system that is the way it is because of something that people came up with, right? So you are maybe implicitly blaming them for making a bad decision at the time when probably they did not know that they were doing that. And it's more upsetting if people didn't quite realize all of the decisions that they were making at the time, which, honestly, we never can know that, right? I make a decision to have sandwiches for lunch. I have let out any other option that I might have had, and some of options that I didn't even know I had. Why didn't you just fix it the last time this happened? Let's take this apart. This very short sentence assumes that it's happened before, maybe more than once. It could have been fixed the last time it happened. Easily, that's what the just means. That you was the right person to fix it, and that there was no good reason not to fix it. That is a lot of assumptions. So, what can you say instead? How? What? What if? Could we? What do you think about? What would you have wanted to know? All of these are designed to get more complex answers when used in a question. When you're asking a question in a retrospective, think about what you can say that will get the longest and most complicated answer. This might be hard because in business we sometimes get in the habit of asking questions that will get us the most concise answer possible, and that's like really appropriate in a lot of business contexts. So you might need to practice asking questions that elicit complex answers, but it's worth it. It really helps. Think about this as a creative process, both for you and for everyone else participating in your retrospective. One of the things that you're trying to do together is imagine a better world. When you ask these better questions, what you're looking for is called a remediation item, an idea for a change that we can make to code, to documentation, or to processes that will give us a different outcome in the future should we see conditions kind of like the ones that we just saw. At Heroku, we call this contributing factor discovery and not root cause analysis, because complex systems have complex failures, and talking about a single root cause keeps us focused on finding one thing to change when what we actually want is to understand how many things that we could change and then choose among them. We often hear that something went wrong because of human error. But human error is where you should start your investigation, not end it. People make the best decisions they can with the information they have, as we talked about previously. So, how did the human make the error? What allowed the error to happen? How did the error take the system down? How long did it take the human to notice the error? All of those can change the impact of a person making a mistake. Try harder is not a remediation. Doesn't work like that. The fallacy is, well, now that we know about this kind of mistake, we can just not do it again in the future. When has that ever worked? Do we all always put our keys exactly where they should go every time and never lose them? No. Depending on humans to avoid errors is unreasonable. People can't be perfectly vigilant, and they can't be better rested. The human you had today is the human you are going to have next time this happens. So let's next talk about how to have a great meeting. It's possible. If you're the one facilitating, have an agenda, stick to it, and stay on time. This helps keep you from missing things by running out of time. It lets participants know what you'll cover and when. It helps participants stay in sync with the rest of the group, because people who are lost feel self-conscious and are less comfortable engaging. Digressions can be boring for the group, or inhibit participation, especially if one person is filibustering or they have a hobby horse, that thing they trot out every time we talk about the API. Oh my God, could you just stop talking about it? Staying on track helps make sure that everyone can be engaged. If you're participating, your job is to help the group stay on track. Before you share, ask yourself if what you have to say is on topic and if it needs the whole group's attention. If one of those is not true, try to bring it up later in a more appropriate context. Keep your eye on the agenda, stay engaged, even if you have nothing to contribute right now. Sometimes the best findings in a retrospective are about the interactions between participants, not just one person saying the thing that they understand. Help make sure note-taking is shared fairly by volunteering when it's your turn, right? Like share that around, because if you have the same person taking notes every time, that person cannot contribute. So part of your job as an attendee is to take some of that burden some of the time. If you're facilitating, you're gonna have to interrupt people sometimes. And you're gonna need to learn how to do this. It's a skill. This is necessary when people start to rant, complain, blame, get off topic. It can be super uncomfortable to do. It took me a long time to learn this. And I can't always do it right on command. Remind yourself that you can't achieve the goals of the retro if this person and their hobby horse or their rant goes unchecked. The best way to practice this is to think about a time that you experienced when someone needed to be interrupted and they weren't. Do you remember that feeling, like the feeling that you had a moment ago when you laughed, and just stop talking about that, right? That feeling, like maybe it's a tightness in your chest or your shoulders go up or whatever that feeling is in your body. Bring that up, remember what it was like, and picture yourself saying, I'm going to pick on my coworker, my former coworker, Lex, who I wrote this with originally. Lex, thank you so much, but we really need to get back on track, and this is off topic. That's all it's got to be. If you need to think, you can say, wait a minute, please, and then figure out what to say next to get the group back on topic. But do it gently and firmly. The person you're interrupting may even feel good about it in the end. I had a retrospective with the chief financial officer. It was a billing retrospective where we had screwed up billing for multiple days. It was like, it'd been a really bad incident. It was a very large retrospective. And he'd never been to a retrospective before. And he was super, agitated. And at some point he broke in, because the rest of us were sort of calmly going through, we know how to do retro. We're doing what we do every time. And he said, I can't believe you're not taking this seriously. You're just talking about this like it's not a big deal. Where's the sense of urgency? Don't you even care? And he kept going, and I had to cut him off and say, we are going through a retrospective like we do for every incident, including really large incidents. We are giving this all of the consideration that we give every incident that we have. Please, take a seat and pay attention. And he was super, I could see him seething. He was just boiling, but he did shut up. And then a day or two later, he came to me and said, you were right, I'm sorry. I didn't understand what you were doing. I didn't understand that calmness meant you were focused. I didn't understand that this is a skill that all of you have built up. I didn't know what I was seeing, and I shouldn't have said that. So thanks for telling me. You're not gonna get that every time. But I didn't even expect to get it that once, so. As a facilitator, one of your jobs is to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak, even if they have nothing to say. Don't assume that because a person is silent, it means they have nothing to say. They might be shy, they might be having a hard time interjecting. Keep an eye on the participants to see who might want to speak, but be afraid to interrupt. Things to watch for: wiggling, leaning forward, licking their lips, biting their lips, lips pursed as if they're ready to get started speaking, frowning, nodding, other really engaged facial expressions or body language. If you're on a call, muting and unmuting, trying to speak, can't speak, trying to speak, can't speak. I think we've probably all done that if we've been on video calls, right? Take time to stop the discussion periodically and ask the people who've been silent whether they have anything to say. It sometimes helps to do this by name. Do this partway through and do it at the end if you can. And when you do it, get comfortable with silence. Wait until it feels really uncomfortable and then wait a little more. Because people who are having a hard time sorting out their thoughts or figuring out what to say next need that time to get things together before they can speak. Okay, let's talk about humor. Or maybe we could not. You may have heard the saying, comedy is tragedy plus time. In a retrospective, there has not been enough time. Furthermore, someone, maybe everyone in that retrospective feels like they screwed up and cost the company money, their teammates time, and maybe sleep, and made everyone present have yet another meeting. And probably their manager is present too. So making jokes is really dodgy under these circumstances. Getting it wrong when making a joke means anything that makes anyone in the room feel even a little bit uncomfortable, even if they don't really notice it or they won't tell you about it. Some bad jokes. Anything your parents say when they're mad or they think you haven't come home recently enough. Anything you say back to them. Anything a manager or other employee ever said to you that made you feel bad. Anything you ever said to a coworker that made them laugh uncomfortably or wince. Jokes about getting fired or firing people. really bad. Don't do it. Politics, religion, current events, especially current events right now. Things I shouldn't have to mention, but I'm gonna anyway. Race, gender, sexuality, fact jokes, jokes about disabilities, crazy, jokes about any one person or their decisions or their wisdom or their plans or their face. You can probably make jokes about Murphy's Law, entropy, the general terribleness of computers. You can be utterly serious about very silly things. One of my favorites, because I have to go to reInvent every year, is Las Vegas, colloquially known as fabulous. Maybe you can joke with a person about something they are proud of about themselves. If you knew that I liked making jokes about myself as the girl with her hair on fire, you might be able to make that joke. But if not everyone in the room knows that I feel good about that, then you may have just made them feel uncomfortable. So it's better to stay away from that sort of thing unless you're super sure of your relationships with everyone present and their relationships with each other. So if you can't make jokes, what can you do? Be kind, be thoughtful, be caring, call out successes, thank someone for their honesty. You can be warm and welcoming. What about when things go wrong? What do you do when other people blame or make bad jokes? What about when you make a mistake? If you make a bad joke or accidentally say something blamey, or you can tell you've made someone uncomfortable, apologize, correct yourself, and move on. That's it. It's important to be sincere, but matter of fact. Do not wallow. Wallowing is self-blame, it's uncomfortable, it's time-consuming, and it is part of what you are trying to avoid in creating a good atmosphere in your retrospective. Sometimes people will blame themselves. You might need to intervene. You might just need a short request to ask them to stop and then move on. If the person is embarrassed or wants to explain, they want to sort of keep taking up time with this, you can give them a moment, thank them sincerely, and move on. You can say things like, this is a blameless retrospective. That means not blaming anyone, including yourself. We're here to make sure no one gets blamed, including you. Or please don't blame yourself. That's not what we're here for. You don't have to be witty. If someone else's messes up, you don't have to be clever, you don't have to make a joke, you don't have to win, you don't have to one-up anybody. Your goal is to remind people of the ground rules and why we're here, and then move on. If someone asks a blaming question, gently remind them that we're trying to avoid blame. Help them reframe the question. I've actually had really good experiences with, could you please try to reframe that? Just like very short. Someone else makes a bad joke, please don't make jokes like that in a retrospective. That's all you gotta say. During the retrospective is not the time to try to have a teachable moment. You don't need to convince anyone of anything. You just need to make them stop as quickly as possible so the group can move on. If their joke is something like, I fat fingered it, where they're blaming themselves, you can say gently, retrospectives are blameless, and that includes not blaming ourselves, or you can just ask that they not make jokes like that in a retro. Once you've gotten them to stop and the group has moved on, do not bring it up again. As far as you're concerned, this is finished. If they come to you and ask why it was inappropriate, you can choose to explain it to them if you want to do that, or you can just reiterate that that is not appropriate for a retro. We all have Google. We can all learn things ourselves. You don't have to always be the teacher. Okay, so what's the point? Most of you are probably familiar with this, Conway's Law, coined by Melvin Conway in 1968, so that's been a minute. Longer than I've been here. Your retrospectives are part of the communication structures of your organization. So under Conway's Law, that means that the results of your retrospectives show up in the products that you produce. It's turtles all the way down, folks. Let's go make bigger, more interesting mistakes. I have some acknowledgements here. I won't read through them. I'm kind of out of time. Thank you so much for coming.
We have time for a few questions.
A few questions? Okay. Apparently, we do have time for a few questions. And I'm comfortable with silence. What's my favorite probing question? I like to ask about what people knew at the time, or what they could see, or what they wish they could have seen, right? It's this whole observability thing, right? If you know, whatever you know in an incident is necessarily incomplete. And so I want to know what information people were able to find. Sometimes it's that there's more information available that they didn't know, or sometimes it's just not there. We need to do better instrumentation. No, it is not on. I can repeat it. Yes.
So you did say basically don't use the word you. Or at least try to way that it might be interpreted like that. But one of my personal pet peeves is when people say the word we, and what they really mean is you. When we do that, they mean can you do that. So how do you do that? How do you deal with that?
Right, okay, so the question is about avoiding the use of you, which I advocated for, but then there's also a problem when people say we and they mean you, and it's maybe passive aggressive, it's making different assumptions, which are also not healthy, right? So, yeah, okay. I think that I would ask them to explain who we is in what they're talking about, right? And you can ask them very, like, sort of straightforwardly, like, just make sure your body language is as neutral as you can make it, and you say, can you tell me more about who the we is that you're referring to here? I want to make sure that I understand what you're asking for. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so. But I guess also, like, on the other side, if you were talking to someone.
How do you avoid doing the bad way? Yeah. I avoid it by making sure that I ask my questions beginning with how or what instead of why. And when talking about a person, try to put the you a little bit later in the sentence instead of it's the beginning, right? Does that make sense? Cool. And find me later if you want to talk about this more, for sure. Yeah.
You deal with that?
So in your case, retros are team meetings and not just like specifically about an incident. Okay, and how would I deal with that? Is there a facilitator in your retrospectives? Yes, there is. Is it the manager? Yes, it's the manager. Okay. So that can be tough, especially if your manager isn't on board with all of the stuff that I was just talking about, hasn't been trained in like any kind of facilitation. I would probably try to approach that with the manager initially and say, here's some things that happen at retrospectives that I don't feel good about, assuming that that's why you're asking this question. Here's some things that I think might be better. Would you be willing to try them? Or, I'd like to try running the next retro. How do you feel about that? Or, how would you feel about us rotating who runs the retro? Does that help? Okay. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Any thoughts on more structured incident retrospectives, like the 5 whys structure?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not a fan of 5 whys. 5 whys, again, is like this, oppositional kind of thing, but it's also, each why question tends to be very specific, and you tend to narrow your focus, where I feel like a really effective retro, when asking about what happened and what we could do differently, you basically should have so many options that you're spoiled for choice, right? You should have this expanding realm of possibilities. And I ask how questions for that, which is something I picked up from John Alspaugh. He gave a tutorial at Velocity some years ago. And that was like the really big thing that I took away from that tutorial was if you ask a how question, you get a more complicated answer. And it's not in this because this is the really short form, but I give an example of like, why did you knock over the vase? Because I tripped over the cat. How did you knock over the vase? Well, I tripped over the cat because I was looking for my glasses and I couldn't see him. So you get a more complicated answer, you can ask more questions, you get more avenues for exploration. And that's called infinite hows. Do I have any facilitation training that I would recommend? There are a bunch of things that are sort of adjacent to this. I have done tutorials or workshops at LISA and SRECon. So LISA this year is going to be in Portland. Call for papers is not open yet, so I don't know if I'm doing my tutorial there yet, but maybe. Things that are related to this, search inside yourself training, crucial conversations, problem-solving leadership, which is a 6-day course in Albuquerque given by the people, sort of the professional successors to Jerry Weinberg. Some of you might know his name. Those are the things that I can think of off the top of my head. How are we doing on time? Okay. Ready? Should I cut it off or ask for any more? Oh, all right, great.
Hi, do you have any thoughts on the practice of follow-on meetings to retrospectives to basically with the goal of seeing whether the recommendations were implemented?
Okay. I don't... So the immediate thought that I have is that I haven't seen that work super well anyplace because it takes a lot more human time, and often it's tough for the organization to invest that many hours, right? It's tough to take people away from other things that they might be doing if you don't have folks dedicated to that task. And if you do have folks dedicated to that task, that is sort of, can be kind of soul-crushing, right? To be the one who every week is like, hey, how's it going? How's it going this week, right? And whoever is getting those requests is like, we still don't have it done. We still don't have it done. God, could you stop asking me, right? So I don't have a good solution for that one. One thing that Heroku was doing for a long time was that each team like managed their own backlog and got paged for their own stuff. And so the things that were the most painful did rise to the top and get fixed. And I think that might still be my preferred method because I haven't seen the other ones work without a lot of friction. But I don't think that we have a good answer to that yet. I think that's something that we need to work on organizationally, like as an industry. Great. Thank you all so much.